I remember the smell of the lilies in the foyer of our first home. It was a scent that, for 20 years, I associated with safety. My name is Evelyn, and for 2 decades, I lived in a world where the most difficult decision I had to make was the color of the curtains or the school our children would attend. Thomas was my rock. He was a man of meticulous habits, a provider who never let a bill go unpaid or a birthday go uncelebrated. We were the couple people looked at and whispered they made it. Our marriage wasn't just a union, it was a masterpiece of stability. Thomas was a high-level executive at a prestigious architectural firm. He had this way of coming home, loosening his tie, and letting out a sigh that sounded like contentment. He would kiss my forehead and tell me that everything he did, every late night at the office, every business trip to Chicago or New York, was for us. And I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Our bank accounts were always full, our vacations were lavish, and our children, Sarah and Leo, grew up wanting for nothing. I felt like the conductor of a beautiful, silent orchestra. I managed the house, the social life, and the emotional well-being of our family, while Thomas provided the stage upon which we all performed. I remember the nights we spent on the back porch, watching the sunset over the valley. Thomas would hold my hand, his palm rough but warm, and talk about our retirement. He spoke of a villa in Tuscany, of quiet mornings and long walks. He had it all planned out. He was the man with a plan. I never felt the need to look at the bank statements or question the investments. In my mind, that was his domain, his way of protecting me. I saw my ignorance not as a weakness, but as a luxury he provided. I was protected from the cold, hard realities of numbers. But looking back now, through the lens of everything I know, those memories feel like a beautifully painted set that was about to be struck. The perfection was too polished. The stability was too rigid. I didn't realize that a house built on a foundation of secrets can only stand for so long before the weight of the truth causes the first crack to appear. I lived in the light of his success, never noticing the long, dark shadows he was casting behind him. I thought I knew the man I slept next to every night. I thought I knew our life. But I was merely a guest in a story he had written entirely by himself. The silence of our home was never heavy. It was a comfortable, expensive kind of silence. I remember the Sunday mornings best. Thomas had a ritual of grinding coffee beans by hand, the mechanical whirring sound acting as the heartbeat of our kitchen. He would stand there, framed by the sunlight streaming through the oversized bay windows, looking every bit the successful patriarch. He used to tell me that the sound of the house, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the wind through the oak trees in the yard was the sound of a job well done. We would sit together, sharing the Sunday paper, and he would point out architectural projects his firm had completed, his eyes gleaming with a pride that I mistook for professional integrity. I felt like I was part of a legacy. In those early years, and even well into our second decade, there was never a reason to doubt. When we bought the lake house, Thomas handled all the paperwork with a quiet efficiency that I admired. You just worry about the upholstery and the guest list, Evie, he would say with that reassuring smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I'll handle the boring stuff. And I leaned into that. I leaned into it so hard that I lost my own footing without even realizing it. I signed documents he put in front of me during dinner, barely looking past the X marked in pencil. I trusted his hand more than I trusted my own eyes. To me, those papers were just symbols of our growing prosperity, not the chains they would eventually become. Our social circle was an extension of this perfection. We hosted charity galas, where Thomas was always the most charismatic man in the room. I watched him navigate conversations about hedge funds, offshore developments, and market volatility with a grace that made me feel safe. I was the wife of Thomas Sterling, and in our town, that name meant something. It meant credit, it meant respect, and it meant a future that was as certain as the rising sun. I remember a specific night, our 15th anniversary, when he gave me a diamond necklace that cost more than my first car. As he fastened the clasp, he whispered in my ear that I deserved the world because I had given him a home to come back to. I felt a surge of love, so pure it blinded me to the fact that he never actually explained where the money for such a gift came from during a year, when his firm had supposedly faced layoffs. I spent my days organizing the lives of our children, ensuring they had the best tutors, the best sports equipment, and the best memories. I was building a museum of a life, curating every moment to ensure it looked flawless from every angle. Thomas was the benefactor of this museum, the silent partner who made the beauty possible. We had a rhythm, a synchronized dance of domesticity that felt unbreakable. Even when we disagreed, it was always handled with a quiet, polite dignity. We didn't scream. We didn't break things. We were too civilized for that. I thought we were the exception to the rule that all marriages have a dark side. I thought we had outrun the shadows. I didn't know that the light I was basking in was artificial, a spotlight operated by a man who was becoming a stranger while sleeping right beside me. The shift didn't happen with a bang. It happened in the quiet spaces between his breaths. It started about 3 years ago, a subtle erosion of the man I thought I knew. Thomas began to stay at the office later than usual, which wasn't strange in itself, but it was the way he looked when he finally walked through the door. His eyes, once clear and focused, started to look clouded, as if he were constantly calculating something in the back of his mind. The sighs that used to sound like contentment now carried the weight of exhaustion or, perhaps, though I didn't want to admit it then, the weight of a guilty conscience. I remember a Tuesday night, specifically. I had prepared a small celebration for his promotion to senior partner. I had his favorite vintage wine chilling and the table set with the fine linen. When he arrived, 2 hours late, he didn't even notice the candles. He walked straight to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a double scotch, and stood looking out at the darkened garden. When I touched his shoulder, he flinched. It was a small, quick movement, but it felt like a physical blow to my heart. Just a long day. Evie, he muttered, his voice sounding thin, like paper being torn. He didn't look at me. For the first time in 20 years, I felt like a ghost in my own dining room. Then there were the phone calls. Thomas had always been professional, but suddenly his phone became an extension of his hand, a glowing rectangular barrier between us. He would take calls in the middle of dinner, stepping out onto the patio, his voice dropped to a low, urgent murmur. When I asked who it was, the answer was always the same, just a client, honey. Someone's panicking about a deadline. But the panic seemed to be transferring to him. I noticed his hands shaking slightly when he set the phone down. He started keeping his briefcase locked in his home office, a room that had once been an open space for the kids to do their homework, but was now a fortress of mahogany and silence. The most disturbing sign, however, was the change in our conversations about the future. The villa in Tuscany, the long walks, the quiet mornings, they stopped being topics of discussion. Whenever I brought up our retirement plans, he would become uncharacteristically sharp. "We're fine, Evelyn. Why are you suddenly so obsessed with the money?" He snapped one evening when I asked about a routine tax document the accountant had mentioned. I wasn't obsessed. I was just noticing that, for a man who had everything under control, he seemed to be losing his grip on the simplest things. He began to look older, the lines around his eyes deepening not from laughter, but from a tension that seemed to vibrate off his skin. I started finding small things that didn't make sense. A receipt for an expensive jewelry store I'd never visited. A bank notification for an account I didn't recognize, tucked inside a magazine. When I confronted him, he had an answer for everything. He was a master of the reasonable explanation. The jewelry was for a client's wife's birthday gift from the firm. The account was an old one he was closing. He spoke with such conviction that I felt ashamed for doubting him. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of his high-level job was finally taking its toll, and that my job was to be his peace, not his prosecutor. I chose to believe the lie because the truth felt like a cold wind I wasn't ready to face. The distance wasn't a wall. It was a fog that rolled in so slowly I didn't realize I was lost until I couldn't see my own hands in front of me. I began to notice the small, jagged edges of his personality that had once been so smooth. Thomas started coming home with the smell of expensive cigarettes on his clothes, a habit he had quit the day Sarah was born. When I asked him about it, he didn't even look up from his laptop. Client meetings, Evie. Everyone at the firm is on edge. It's secondary smoke, nothing more. But the way he avoided my gaze told the story that his words tried to hide. It was the first time I felt that he wasn't just tired, he was hiding. There was a Friday in late autumn when the reality of our disconnection hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had spent the afternoon at the grocery store, buying all the ingredients for the beef bourguignon he loved. As I was putting the bags in the trunk, I saw his car, the silver Mercedes he took such pride in, pull into the parking lot of a local motel across the street. My heart stopped. I stood there, frozen, watching him get out. He wasn't meeting a woman, he was alone. He sat in his car for 45 minutes, staring at nothing, his head resting against the steering wheel. He looked broken. I didn't approach him. I was too afraid of what I might find, or worse, what I might have to say. When he came home 2 hours later, he told me he had been stuck in a conference call. I smelled the lie before he even finished the sentence, but I served the dinner anyway. I served the wine, and I smiled, while my insides felt like they were turning to ash. Our intimacy, once a source of profound comfort, became a series of polite transactions. He would hold me at night, but his body felt like a statue, cold, rigid, and distant. He was physically there, but his mind was miles away, perhaps lost in the spreadsheets and ledgers that seemed to be consuming his soul. I started noticing that he would wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I was asleep. I would keep my eyes closed, my breathing rhythmic and fake, while I watched him through my eyelashes. He would sit on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, whispering numbers to himself. It was a terrifying litany of debt and deadlines that I couldn't quite catch. The mail became a source of intense anxiety for him. He, who had always been so relaxed about the Daily Post, began racing to the mailbox the moment the mailman's truck rounded the corner. If I happened to get there first, he would practically snatch the envelopes out of my hand. "It's just business, Evelyn. Boring, corporate junk," he'd say, his voice tight. One afternoon, I saw a letter from a private investigation firm addressed to him. It was a thick, heavy envelope. When I asked him about it, he turned a shade of gray I had never seen on a living person. He claimed it was due diligence for a new partner at the firm. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Because if Thomas wasn't the man I thought he was, then who was I? I had defined myself by his success, by our stability. To question him was to question the very fabric of my existence. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, began to feel like a vast, echoing chamber of unasked questions. I found myself walking on eggshells, not because Thomas was explosive, but because he was becoming fragile. The man, who could negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts, seemed to be crumbling under the weight of a simple dinner conversation. I remember the way he would look at our children, Sarah and Leo, during their weekend visits from college. There was a desperate, hungry look in his eyes, as if he were trying to memorize their faces before a curtain fell. He would linger at the doorway of their old rooms, his hand gripping the doorframe, so tightly his knuckles turned white. It wasn't the look of a proud father. It was the look of a man who felt he was losing his grip on everything he loved. I began to notice the financial discrepancies in the most mundane places. My credit card, the one I had used for 2 decades, without a single hiccup, was declined at the local bakery. It was a small amount, barely $20, for a box of pastries. The cashier, a young girl who had known me for years, looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. "I'm sure it's just a system error, Mrs. Sterling," she said softly. I laughed it off, pulled out another card, and moved on, but the cold seed of dread in my stomach began to sprout. When I brought it up to Thomas that evening, he didn't even look up from his papers. "The bank is updating their security protocols, Evelyn. I told you they'd be freezing some accounts temporarily. Don't be so dramatic." His voice was cold, a clinical detachment that left no room for my anxiety. But the most chilling sign was the silence of our social life. People who used to call us every week for dinner or golf began to drift away. There were whispers at the country club that stopped the moment I entered the room. I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill in the air of our community. Thomas dismissed it as professional jealousy, but I saw the way his colleagues looked at him not with respect, but with a guarded, almost fearful curiosity. One afternoon, I found him in the garage, sitting in his car with the engine off, clutching a stack of legal-sized envelopes. He didn't see me watching him through the window. He was weeping silent, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from the very marrow of his bones. I didn't go to him. I was paralyzed by the realization that if I acknowledged his pain, I would have to acknowledge the cause. And I wasn't ready to lose the life I had spent 20 years building. I started to feel like an intruder in my own marriage. Every time I asked a question, I was met with a wall of technical jargon or a sharp reminder of how much he provided for me. You have the house, the cars, the life you wanted. Isn't that enough? He asked one night, his voice laced with a bitterness I had never heard before. It wasn't about the things, but he made it feel that way, turning my genuine concern into a sign of ingratitude. I began to keep my own secrets not out of malice, but out of survival. I started hiding my own observations, tucking them away in the back of my mind like the receipts he hid in his briefcase. We were two people living under the same roof, sharing the same bed, yet we were moving in completely different orbits, held together only by the gravity of a lie that was becoming too heavy to sustain. I decided that Thomas was simply sick, not with a physical ailment that you could see on an X-ray, but with the kind of soul-crushing exhaustion that comes from carrying the world on your shoulders. I told myself that my role as his wife of 20 years was not to question, but to heal. I became an architect of excuses. When the gardener stopped coming because his checks bounced, I told the neighbors we were trying out a more natural look for the landscape. When Thomas stayed in his office for 48 hours straight, I brought him trays of food that he never touched, whispering through the locked door that I loved him, that I was there, that we would get through whatever project was consuming him. I was choosing to go blind, stitching my own eyelids shut with threads of loyalty. I started digging into my own modest inheritance, money my grandmother had left me that I had never intended to touch. I began funneling it into our joint account, hoping he wouldn't notice, or perhaps hoping he would. I paid the utility bills in secret. I paid for Sarah's last semester of college tuition with a credit card I opened in my own name, a card Thomas didn't know about. I was drowning, but I was doing it with a smile, convinced that if I could just keep the surface of our lives calm, the storm underneath would eventually dissipate. I believed in the myth of us more than I believed in the evidence before my eyes. I convinced myself that every great man goes through a dark night of the soul, and that my sacrifice was the price of our eventual peace. The denial became a physical weight. I stopped seeing my friends entirely. I couldn't bear the pity in their eyes or the way they lowered their voices when I walked by. I stayed inside the house, polishing the silver, dusting the photos of our European vacations, and rearranging the furniture. I was trying to hold on to a reality that was slipping through my fingers like dry sand. One night, I found Thomas burning papers in the fireplace in the middle of July. The heat in the room was stifling, and the smell of charred ink filled the air. I didn't ask him what they were. I simply sat down beside him, took his cold, shaking hand in mine, and stared into the flames. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He just watched the paper curl into black ash, and for a moment I saw a flicker of such profound regret in his eyes that I had to look away. I began to pray not for money, but for time. I prayed that whatever hole Thomas was digging wouldn't swallow our children. I made a pact with a god I hadn't spoken to in years. Take everything else, but leave us our dignity. I was willing to live in a shack, to wear rags, if it meant that the man I loved was still the man I thought he was. I didn't realize that I was negotiating with a ghost. My faith wasn't in a higher power. It was in a version of Thomas that had perhaps never existed. I was a martyr for a lie, sacrificing my own financial security and my own peace of mind to protect a facade that was already hollow. Every time I looked at our wedding album, I saw two people who looked like us, but felt like strangers. And yet, I kept the lights on. I kept the table set for 4. I kept the lie alive, one breath at a time. Com certeza. Vamos mergel enemies fando no abismo donagaka di Evelyn. Di tal hondo como ella kamakua desmantelar sua propria identidade para sustentar a mentira di Thomas. Vamos explorar solidão de sacrificio e o peso do silencio que ela impsa si mesma. BLOCK3, faith, sacrifice, or denial, fé, sacrificio unagaka continuaco English version. I began to live in a state of hypervigilance, a silent sentinel guarding a crumbling fortress. To keep the world from seeing the cracks, I became a master of performance. I remember hosting a small dinner for Thomas's oldest friend and business partner, Marcus. My hands were shaking as I plated the expensive sea bass. Knowing I had paid for it with the last of my grandmother's jewelry that I'd pawned that morning. Every time Marcus asked Thomas about a specific investment or the progress of the new development in the city, I would cut in with a bright, hollow laugh and a story about the kids. I was shielding Thomas, but I was also shielding myself from the look of suspicion on Marcus's face. I was drowning in plain sight, yet I made sure the table was perfectly set, the candles were lit, and the wine, the last good bottle in the cellar, was flowing. The physical toll of this denial started to manifest. I lost weight I didn't have to lose. My hair, once thick and vibrant, began to thin, and I looked in the mirror at a woman who seemed to be fading into the wallpaper. I didn't care. I felt that if I could just be smaller, quieter, and more supportive, Thomas would find his way back to the light. I started selling small things first. An antique clock from the guest room, my collection of first edition books, even my designer handbags. I told myself I was decluttering, but the truth was I was selling my history to buy a few more weeks of a fake future. I would hide the cash in a silk scarf in my dresser, feeling like a criminal in my own home. I was a thief of my own life, stealing from the woman I used to be to pay for the woman I was forced to become. One rainy afternoon, I found a foreclosure notice tucked deep inside one of Thomas's architectural journals. The red ink of the overdue stamp looked like a bleeding wound on the page. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to sit on the floor. Our house. The place where Sarah took her first steps. The place where we had celebrated every Christmas for 20 years. It was being taken away. But instead of screaming, instead of confronting him, I did something far more desperate. I took my iron and carefully smoothed out the paper. Then I hid it at the very bottom of the trash bin, covered by coffee grounds and food scraps. I chose to believe it was a mistake. A clerical error. A nightmare I could wake up from if I just closed my eyes tight enough. I started taking long walks in the evening just to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the house. I would walk past the homes of our neighbors, looking at the warm glow of their windows and wondering if they, too, were living in a house of cards. I felt a strange, dark kinship with the shadows. I was becoming one of them. Thomas and I barely spoke anymore. When we did, it was about the weather or the kids' grades. We were two actors who had forgotten our lines, but refused to leave the stage. I was sacrificing my sanity on the altar of a marriage that had become a ghost story. I was waiting for a miracle, for a phone call that would say it was all a joke, for Thomas to walk in and tell me he had fixed it all. I didn't realize that some things are too broken to ever be mended, and that my faith was just a different name for my fear. Antenno, chegamos ao momento em que o castelo de cartas, meu apenas blanca, mas implode. O bloco for o ponto de ruptura, onde nagaca de Evelyn e brutalmente confrontada pela realidade fria e documental. O fim da iluso. Block 4, The Betrayal or Shock, a triku o choke English version. The truth didn't come from Thomas's lips. It came from a man in a cheap suit holding a clipboard. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary morning that mocks you later with its simplicity. Thomas had left early, his face a mask of gray exhaustion. When the doorbell rang, I expected a package or a neighbor. Instead, I found a process server. He handed me a thick envelope with a look of practiced indifference. Evelyn Sterling, you've been served. As the door clicked shut, the weight of the paper in my hand felt like lead. I opened it in the kitchen, the sunlight still dancing on the granite counters we had chosen together. It wasn't just a foreclosure. It was a lawsuit. A massive, multi-million-dollar fraud claim against Thomas Ann because I had signed those boring documents over dinner. My name was right there next to his. I felt the room tilt. I sat on the floor, the cold tile pressing against my skin, and I read every word. Thomas hadn't just made bad investments. He had been running a sophisticated shell game for nearly a decade. He had embezzled from his firm, drained our children's trust funds, and used our home as collateral for loans from people who didn't use banks. The villa in Tuscany wasn't a dream. It was a fabrication used to explain away the money he was moving through offshore accounts. But the deepest cut, the one that made me gasp for air, was a series of bank statements from a private account in the Cayman Islands. There were monthly transfers to a name I didn't recognize in advance. Thousands of dollars every month for 7 years. I called my cousin, a lawyer who had always been wary of Thomas's perfect life. By the afternoon, I was in his office, and the shock turned into a cold, paralyzing horror. Evelyn," he said, his voice dripping with a pity I could no longer ignore. "It's worse than the lawsuit. Thomas hasn't paid the mortgage in 14 months. The house is already scheduled for auction. And this Eleanor Vance, she's not a business partner. She's the mother of a 6-year-old boy in Connecticut. Thomas has been supporting a second family for nearly a decade." The words hit me like a physical assault. My lungs stopped working. The man I had spent 20 years protecting, the man I had sold my grandmother's jewelry for, hadn't just failed financially. He had erased me. He had sat at our table, kissed our children, and then driven 2 hours away to play father to another child. Every late night, every business trip, every client emergency, it was all a curated lie. I looked at my hands and realized I was shaking so hard I couldn't hold the glass of water my cousin offered. My entire life had been a performance in a play where I was the only one who didn't know the script. I wasn't his partner, I was his cover. I was the respectable wife who made the fraud look like success. The diamond necklace, the gala dresses, the private schools, they were all bought with stolen money and stained with the betrayal of a life I thought was sacred. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a hollow, echoing scream inside my soul that told me I was now a stranger to my own history. Ontendo perfectamente, o impacto dischoc precisa ser explorado em cada detalle sordido. Pois o momento em que a identidade de Evelyn e esta hackada, vamos expander o horror desses. Descobertas e profundidade da triquo. Block 4, The Betrayal or Shock, a triquo ocho continuaco English version. I spent the next few hours in my cousin's office, watching as he pulled up public records and leaked internal memos from Thomas's firm. Each document was a nail in the coffin of my marriage. It wasn't just that he had stolen, it was the clinical, calculated way he had done it. He had created a ghost version of our life, a parallel financial universe, where everything was leveraged to the hilt. I saw my own signature on second and third mortgages I had no memory of signing. I remembered those boring dinners now, the way he would gently place his hand over mine as I signed, his voice a soothing murmur about long-term security. He hadn't been protecting me, he had been using me as a legal shield. If the ship went down, he had made sure I was tied to the anchor. But the financial ruin was a distant second to the emotional carnage. My cousin slid a printed photograph across the desk. It was from a social media account under the name Eleanor Vance. In the photo, Thomas was standing in a modest backyard, wearing a t-shirt and jeans clothes I had never seen him wear. He was flipping burgers at a grill, laughing, with a small boy perched on his shoulders. The boy had Thomas's eyes. The same mischievous spark, the same slight tilt of the head. The caption read, "Daddy's home for the weekend." Best surprise ever. The date on the post was the same weekend Thomas had supposedly been in Seattle for an emergency board meeting. I remembered how I had spent that weekend meticulously cleaning his home office, thinking I was being a supportive wife, while he was playing daddy in a suburban house 3 towns away. The betrayal felt like a physical sickness spreading through my veins. I looked at the boy. His name was Toby, according to the comments, and I felt a sickening mixture of rage and profound grief. This child was the living proof that my 20 years meant nothing to Thomas. I was the official life, the one he used for prestige and social standing, but this other woman, this Elena, was where he went to breathe. Or was she just another victim? I saw photos of her wearing a modest gold band on her left hand. Had he married her too? Was I a bigamist's wife? The questions swirled in my head like a dark cyclone. I realized that every time he had been distant or exhausted with me, he was likely just drained from maintaining two separate identities, two separate sets of lies, two separate hearts. I drove home in a trance, the familiar streets looking like a foreign country. When I walked back into our house, the silence was no longer comfortable, it was predatory. I looked at the expensive paintings on the walls and saw only the faces of the people Thomas had cheated to buy them. I went into our bedroom and opened his closet. The rows of tailored suits, the polished shoes, the silk ties, it was all a costume. I found a hidden compartment in his mahogany valet box. Inside wasn't jewelry for me, but a second cell phone and a set of keys to a car I didn't recognize. There was also a small, handwritten note. "Thank you for the life you give us, Tom. We love you more than words, E." I dropped the note as if it had burned me. I realized then that I didn't just need a divorce. I needed an exorcism. I needed to scrub the scent of his lies off my skin, even if it meant tearing my own life apart to do it. I didn't light the lamps. I sat in the darkness of our living room, the one with the silk wallpaper and the Persian rug that was now just evidence of a crime. I waited Dot when the headlights of his car swept across the walls. I didn't flinch. I heard the garage door, the heavy thud of his briefcase, and his weary footsteps. He walked into the kitchen, sighing that same old sigh of exhaustion that I now knew was just the fatigue of a predator. When he finally noticed me sitting there, a shadow among shadows, he jumped, "Evelyn, why are you sitting in the dark? You scared me." His voice was still trying to maintain the facade, still trying to sound like the husband who cared. I didn't say a word. I just stood up and walked to the center of the room, laying the process server's envelope and the printed photo of his other son on the coffee table. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. I watched his face, the way the blood drained from his skin, the way his eyes darted from the legal documents to the photo of the boy on his shoulders. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. For a moment, the high-level executive vanished, and in his place was a small, cornered animal. "Evie, I can explain," he started, his voice cracking. "Explain which part, Thomas?" I asked. And I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. It was the calm of someone who had already watched her world burn to the ground. Explain the millions you stole? Explain the house that's being auctioned next month? Or explain the 6-year-old boy who thinks you're a hero while you're actually a thief who stole his own children's future? He tried to step toward me, to put his hand on my arm, the same hand that had signed those fraudulent deeds. I recoiled as if he were a leper. "Don't you dare touch me," I hissed. He began to babble, a frantic stream of excuses about how he did it for us, how the pressure of maintaining our lifestyle had pushed him into a corner, how he had started with one small loan from the firm and it had spiraled. He even had the audacity to say he loved Elena because she was simple and didn't demand the life I did. I laughed then, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through his lies. "You did this for us? You stole Sarah's tuition for us? You let me pawn my grandmother's rings to pay the electric bill while you were buying burgers for a second family? You're not a provider, Thomas. You're a parasite." I watched him crumble. He sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands, weeping those same silent sobs I had seen in the garage. But this time, I felt no pity. I felt only a cold, crystalline clarity. I told him I had already spoken to my cousin, that the bank accounts were being frozen, and that I would be testifying against him to protect myself and our children from his legal wreckage. He looked up, his eyes red and desperate. "You'd destroy me? After everything?" I leaned down, my face inches from his. "I'm not destroying you, Thomas. You destroyed yourself years ago. I'm just the one turning on the lights so everyone can see the ruins. You have 1 hour to pack a bag. If you're still here when the clock strikes 10, I'm calling the police to report the car. You've been hiding in the storage unit." I walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the ghost of the man he pretended to be. Ontendo perfectament, agora. Entramos no bloco 6. Ondo piso da realidade esmaga o que resto da rotina. E o momento do inventario da dor. Ondos destrocos são cantados e o isolamento se torna única companhia de Evelyn, enquanto o mundo exterior começa a cobrar as dívidas de Thomas. Block 6. The Aftermath, as Consequences English version. The silence that followed Thomas's departure was not the peaceful quiet I had once curated. It was the hollow, ringing silence of a bomb site. He left with a single suitcase, the wheels clicking against the hardwood floors, like a countdown to the end of my life. I stood by the window and watched his taillights vanish, realizing that with him went every certainty I had ever owned. By the next morning, the world I had fought so hard to protect began to claw at my door. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Debt collectors, former partners, and even people I thought were friends calling not to offer comfort, but to fish for information about where the money had gone. I was no longer the respected Mrs. Sterling. I was the widow of a living ghost, left to answer for crimes I hadn't committed. The process of losing the house was a slow, public execution. I had to walk through every room with a clipboard, marking what was ours and what belonged to the bank. I watched as men in heavy boots moved through my sanctuary, tagging the piano where Sarah learned to play and the dining table where we had shared 20 Christmases. Every sticker they placed felt like a brand on my skin. I moved into a small, cramped apartment on the edge of town, a place that smelled of old dust and broken dreams. My children, Sarah and Leo, were devastated. Their father wasn't just gone. The version of him they worshipped had never existed. Watching their grief was 1,000 times worse than my own. They looked at me with eyes full of questions I couldn't answer, their inheritance stolen, and their trust shattered. I spent my days in windowless rooms, surrounded by lawyers and forensic accountants. They treated me with a mixture of suspicion and clinical boredom. To them, I was either a co-conspirator or a fool. I had to recount every boring document I signed, every lavish gift I accepted, every vacation we took. I saw the numbers laid out in black and white. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. Thomas hadn't just dipped into a fund, he had systematically bled dry everything he touched. And then there was the other life. I found out through the investigation that Eleanor Vance had truly believed they were married in a small ceremony in another state. She was a victim too, left with a child and a pile of legal threats. We were two women tethered together by the same man's lies, mourning two different versions of the same shadow. The physical world shrank around me. I took a job as an administrative assistant at a small firm where no one knew my name, or at least, they pretended not to. I traded my silk dresses for polyester and my gourmet meals for whatever was on sale at the corner store. But the hardest part wasn't the poverty, it was the loss of my own history. I looked at old photos and saw only the deception. Was that smile real? Was that anniversary trip just a way to move money? Every memory was tainted. Every laugh sounded like a hollow echo. I was a woman in her 50s, starting over from absolute zero, carrying the heavy, invisible luggage of someone else's sins. I lived in the aftermath of a hurricane, picking through the rubble of a 20-year lie, trying to find one single piece of truth that was worth keeping. Chegamos ao capítulo final desta jornada. O bloco 7 não é sober final feliz, mas sobre a citação da realidade e a reconstrução de uma identidade que não depende de mais nenhum. E o momento em que Evelyn para de olhar para os destrocos e começa a olhar para o horizonte. Block 7, the emotional conclusion, a conclusa emotional English version. It has been 2 years since the night the lights went out on my old life. I am sitting in a small, sun-drenched kitchen of an apartment that holds no silk wallpaper or Persian rugs, but for the first time in 2 decades. Every chair and every spoon in this place belongs to me, truly me. Thomas is gone, serving a sentence in a federal facility that matches the grayness he had become. I haven't visited him. There is nothing left to say to a man who was a master of fiction. I realized that the Evelyn he created was just another one of his projects, and I have spent these last 24 months dismantling her to find the woman underneath. The healing didn't come from forgiveness. It came from the cold, hard ground of reality. I stopped asking why and started asking what now. My children and I are rebuilding a different kind of bond, one forged in the fires of a shared betrayal. We don't talk about the money anymore. We talk about the truth. We spent so many years performing for a ghost that we forgot how to just be. Now, when Sarah visits, we sit on my small balcony and talk about her career, not about the prestige of our last name. The sterling name is gone, and in its place is a quiet, resilient dignity. I am no longer protected. I am aware. And there is a profound, terrifying beauty in being the one who holds the keys to her own life, even if that life is smaller than the one I imagined. I recently saw Eleanor Vance. We met in a quiet park halfway between our towns. There were no screams, no accusations. We just looked at each other, two women who had been painted into the same corner by a man with a silver tongue. We shared a cup of coffee and watched Toby play on the swings. The boy still has Thomas's eyes, but I didn't feel the sting of rage this time. I felt a strange, sisterly pity. We were both victims of a man who loved the idea of a family, but couldn't handle the truth of one. As I walked away from that park, I felt a weight lift from my chest. I wasn't carrying his sins anymore. They belonged to him, and he could keep them in his cell. I look at my hands now, and they no longer shake. They are the hands of a woman who works, who pays her own bills, and who knows exactly what she is signing. I still have the photo of the sunset over the valley from our old house, but I keep it in a drawer, not on the wall. It's a reminder that beauty can be a lie, but strength is always real. My life isn't a masterpiece of stability anymore. It's a mosaic of broken pieces, glued back together with a courage I never knew I possessed. I am Evelyn, a woman who lost everything and found herself in the ruins. And for the first time in my life, I am not waiting for a man to tell me that we are going to be okay. I know we are, because I am the one making it so.